Why do we need legal frameworks on energy? For us, don't you think it's just a technological issue? Is it just a finance problem?
We need laws to regulate the transmission of electricity through the entire grid. Grid balancing is one of the key issues that lies before the technical people in the sector.
Yeah.
And you need legal frameworks to allow the electricity to come into the grid, because if too many people are supplying or too many people are off-taking at the same time, then the entire grid is at risk, and it's at the risk of collapse. So that's one good reason to have it.
So why do we need regulation in the first place? I mean, isn't it that deregulation is fine?
The distribution companies were set up to deal with in the first place.
Yeah.
So if we had privatized them or deregulated them at that point in time, then we could possibly have imagined them to be in better financial shape now, and therefore the problems that we have in relation to private companies selling to distribution companies might not have existed to the same extent.
क्या इलेक्ट्रिसिटी अपने आप में कमोडिटी है या ये सर्विस है या ये कंफ्यूज्ड स्टेट में है अभी?
Anything that's produced in the economy requires inputs to produce it. Those inputs have to be paid for. So I think it's a question of approach. It's better to treat it as a commodity, to allow it to be bought and sold at the price which the market determines for it.
Do you see some role of civil society? Do you see some role of think tanks and not-for-profit institutes and centers to ensure that there is some light of the day that these policies also see?
I don't think there's any stakeholder who should not be involved.
What are these top 2 or 3 legal challenges that you see in today's world wherein you want to move towards cleaner energy options?
I'm not a big fan generally of top 5 and top 3 and top 10 type of lists. I think it's very much a function of the internet age. But what I'd like to see happening is for people to see this in terms of principles, is to look at law and policy making in terms of principles. And ultimately, when we look at how the sector is going to grow or how the energy transition is going to take place, this is not going to take place with the majority of the cash coming from government.
Yeah.
Majority of the money is going to come from the private sector.
Today, we are going to talk about the role of law, policy, and regulation in the context of clean energy transition. And to do that, we have a very special guest with us, Mr. Akshay Jaitly. Akshay is the founding partner of Trilegal and the founder of TrustBridge. Over to you, Akshay. I think just to start with, I would love to hear more about the vision of Trilegal, the vision of TrustBridge, and why it was started.
Starting with very big and heavy questions, but Trilegal now is 25 years old this year, and so it represents the vast majority of my time as a lawyer and in the legal profession. And the idea of setting up the firm at the time was fairly simple. It was really to have a place in which those of us who were the founders, and there were 6 of us in the beginning, where we felt we would feel comfortable going into work every day. And by that it meant a place which recognized merit, which recognized achievement, which honored the principles of hard work, being client-centric, etc., which we felt that some of the traditional firms which were largely family-oriented or individual-dominated didn't offer. So that was the vision, and the vision, of course, changed over time. We became ambitious quite quickly, and the vision became to become the best firm in the country, which is what we are trying to do today. And I'm happy to say that 25 years later, we are amongst the top 2 or 3 firms in the country by size, and perhaps the top firm by reputation.
But Akshay, just for a layman, why do we need legal frameworks on energy? I mean, for us, don't you think it's just a technological issue? Is it just a finance problem? Why legal frameworks?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's a question that I think requires a little more careful consideration than often is given. One of the examples I like to give very often is for us to think of electricity as any other commodity. So, like any other commodity, electricity is produced, electricity is taken to the market, electricity is then sold to a wholesaler, and the wholesaler might sell it to retailers and ultimately to a consumer. So, in that context, there's one key difference. And the key difference is that so far, we have not been able to store electricity at scale. As a consequence of which, the dynamics of each leg and the transition from one leg to the other, from production to taking to the market to sale, each one of these has interesting kinks in it because of the storage issue. Grid balancing is one of the key issues that lies before the technical people in the sector.
Yeah.
And you need legal frameworks to allow the electricity to come into the grid, because if too many people are supplying or too many people are off-taking at the same time, then the entire grid is at risk, and it's at the risk of collapse. So that's one good reason to have it. The other good reason to have laws is because electricity tends to be monopolistic in the manner in which it is bought and sold. It is not easy to have multiple providers and multiple suppliers at the moment. Maybe in the future that will be the case, but at the moment we can't do that. As a consequence of which, potential monopolistic behavior by market participants is possible, and therefore we need the regulation of through competition law in that sector. And if I were to add these two up and add, for instance, the following of standards and a couple of other issues, one way that the economists would put it is to say that law and regulation in the electricity sector should be regulating for market failure. And we should otherwise allow the sector to function as a market, just as we allow all other sectors to function as markets.
But Akshay, looking at the whole sector, the whole supply chain of the electricity sector, isn't it that the generation particularly is deregulated, while the end, which is connected to the consumer, the distribution side of it, it's fairly licensed and I think regulated and so on. And as a layman, if you see, I think it's the distribution which has more complexities and problems than generation, isn't it? I mean, it's the distribution which is facing and accumulating losses in the books probably than generation, isn't it? So why do we need regulation in the first place? I mean, isn't it that deregulation is fine?
I'm a great fan of deregulation. And if you go back to the history of the sector, I think the key date or the key year in the history of the sector is the year 2003, when the
Electricity Act.
When the Electricity Act came into force. And what the Act did was, a few years before, the regulators had already been set up. But what the Act did, and the reason the Act came into place, was in order to deal with the enormous amount of debt that had accumulated in the books of the distribution companies, as you were mentioning a short while ago. So what it did was it split the functions of distribution, generation, and transmission into three separate pieces, because these were all otherwise under one roof, either in the form of an electricity board in each state of the country,
A bundled entity.
or it was within the electricity or the energy department of each state. So it wasn't even necessarily either a corporate entity or split out from the prime functioning of government. So what the Act did was, it provided the framework for states to move towards what was called unbundling in those days. And many states, most states at that point in time, unbundled. In other words, they split distribution, generation, and transmission into three separate entities. But I think the basic premise of your statement, that why not deregulate much more deeply, is something that I'm a big proponent of, and I've written quite a lot about it. And in fact, it's a question that I tend to ask, which is, what is the vision that we have long term for the sector in India? Because whatever reforms we put into place now, whether it's as a consequence of the energy transition, or to improve efficiency, or for whatever reason, I feel that you need to have some vision, some end goal in mind, which is what should the sector look like. And to my mind, that should be a deregulated sector. And if that is the goal, then the kinds of steps you would take today would be a little clearer, I think. And perhaps we can argue about what order those steps could be taken.
Yeah.
But I think at least the direction will be a bit clearer.
Is it really a commodity or a service? Is that the debate still on? Looking at what is happening in the real world, you have all these elections coming up and, freebies getting announced, whether it is around electricity pricing or it is about food supplies and so on and so forth. And going forward, I don't know in whichever way it will increase or decrease, and ultimately there will be accumulated losses and so on. So, is it really a commodity here? क्या electricity अपने आप में commodity है या ये service है या ये confused state में है अभी?
Well, let's look at anything that is produced in the economy. Anything that's produced in the economy requires inputs to produce it. Those inputs have to be paid for.
Yeah.
Whether they are paid for by the consumer through payment for that at the point of sale, or whether they are paid for by the consumer in the form of taxes, they have to still be paid for.
Somebody is paying for it.
Somebody is paying for it. The government cannot generate money out of nothing.
True.
So the question is, how do you want it to be paid for? So there are certain things which is harder to ask people to pay for. For instance, roads. So especially roads, say in a city, highways we still ask people to pay for through tolls. Roads in a city we don't ask people to pay for, but they are being paid for by your and my taxes, right? Now the question is, do we want electricity to be more like a road in a city which is not paid for but is paid indirectly through taxes? Or do we want it to be more in the nature of a toll road, which is paid for by user payments?
And hence maintained and lit up properly and so on and so on.
And what you do is you have private involvement to build the road, to maintain the road. And therefore, most people will agree that the highways are in better shape than many city roads. So I think it's a question of approach. I think that economists who are far cleverer than me on this issue will tell you that it's better to treat it as a commodity, to allow it to be bought and sold at the price which the market determines for it.
Yeah.
And to the extent that anyone is struggling to pay for it because of poverty or similar reasons, to put money in their hands so that they can pay for it. Because otherwise what happens is that the entire sector gets distorted. And that, I'm afraid, has been the history of our power sector in this country.
I think the next question in my mind was to do with again, the legal framework. See, Akshay, one is to sort of set up these legal frameworks. One is to set up the right policy levers, acts and regulations in place. The other thing is all about enforcing it, implementing it on ground, right? And while there had been a lot of nicely written policies, and you mentioned about Electricity Act itself, I believe even the Electricity Act talks about this cross subsidy surcharge to be in the range of plus minus 20%, which I don't think is ever implemented. It's more than 20 years gone. So enforcement and implementation is a different ball game altogether. And I don't know, going forward, do you see a role of stakeholders maybe outside of these closed doors, which the policymakers often are kind of defined in a way? Do you see some role of civil society? Do you see some role of think tanks and not-for-profit institutes and centers to ensure that there is some light of the day that these policies also see?
I think, as with any major issue in the economy, especially those that are significantly impacted by politics and the political economy around this, I don't think there's any stakeholder who should not be involved. So if you ask if there's a role for think tanks and policy, people who think about policy, universities, etc., my answer is all of the above and as much as possible. I think that because of the fact that there are so many entrenched views in this sector, and because so many of those views are responding to the political economy that many stakeholders, especially on the government and political side, face, I think we need to keep making these points repeatedly and often and with greater depth, so that ultimately people realize that this is something that needs to be addressed. So I think that there is a role for all kinds of actors in this field. But I think the big problem, and which is why I think the way that policymakers outside of government or policy thinkers need to approach power sector reform, is by keeping the lens of the political economy squarely in focus. Because ultimately, whether it's right or wrong, politicians will respond to what the electorate wants. And therefore, we have to think of the solutions that we want to propose within the realm of what might be possible for a politician at the moment that we are proposing them.
Now, in terms of, again, these legal barriers and challenges of the day, uh, what are these top 2 or 3 legal challenges that you see in today's world, wherein you want to move towards cleaner energy options and also want to become a developed nation, say by 2047 or 2050, a Viksit Bharat you want to see?
Gosh, that's a difficult question to answer. I'm not a big fan generally of top 5 and top 3 and top 10 type of lists. I think it's very much a function of the internet age. I generally see these issues from the perspective of investors. I have been for all my career as a lawyer an advisor to investors and providers of capital, whether it's debt or equity. So, and ultimately, when we look at how the sector is going to grow or how the energy transition is going to take place, this is not going to take place with the majority of the cash coming from government. The majority of the money is going to come from the private sector. So then we have to put ourselves into the minds of the private sector decision maker and say, what are the things that they think about when they're making a decision in relation to investing money? And what does an investor want under any circumstances? They want to know what the risk-reward matrix is. They want to know what the level of risk is and what the return they're going to get. And different types of investors have different risk thresholds and reward expectations. So for instance, if you take a private equity player is happier with a slightly higher level of risk and expects a higher reward. On the other hand, a sovereign wealth fund or an long-term infrastructure fund or a Canadian pension fund will be happier with a lower level of risk and a lower rate of return. So the point is, who are your policies catering to? What are the kinds of investors you want? If you want patient capital, long-term investors, then we have to look to reducing the risk for them. And because we know that they are happy with lower returns. So our whole policy thinking and our lawmaking has to be oriented then towards that type of investor. And I've used the word risk a number of times. That type of investor hates risk. And at the moment, our energy sector, and for that matter, all our infrastructure sectors, have too high a level of risk for very large scale investment by these kinds of players. So I'm talking about things like certainty of contracts, of predictability in the manner in which law will be enforced, of an idea of the time frame within which disputes will be settled. It's really the fundamental building blocks of how a good economy functions, which is predictability and putting the means in the hands of investors to manage risk, which at the moment we have far too much uncertainty. And the kinds of questions that I'm answering for investors today are not qualitatively different from the kinds of questions I was answering when I worked on India's first financed wind project in the late 2000, in 2007 or 8. It's the same kinds of questions. The degree of risk might have changed a bit, but qualitatively the risks are the same. Will I be paid if there's change in law? Will a force majeure clause be honored? Will my interconnection come in time when it's been promised? Will I be paid on time? These kinds of fundamental questions are still the questions that investors are seeking the answers for. And until we can give them clear answers on these, we are not going to get the levels of investment that we would like to see. Now, people will point to the renewable energy sector and say, look, the numbers go up significantly every year. But I think we should not be comparing ourselves to ourselves yet. Last year, we should be comparing ourselves to what the US is doing and what China is doing and what Europe is doing. Where in China, for example, the level of investment doubles from a base which is already 10 times of ours.
Wow.
So, we're not in the same.
But there are not enough conflicts, there are not enough cases, there are not enough non-abiding of these contracts typically in the Chinese economy. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think that for these kinds of issues, China isn't the best example because rule of law in China can be enforced from above.
Yeah.
We are a noisy and sometimes messy democracy, and I prefer it that way. But it means that there's less certainty. But outside of the manner in which the rule of law functions in its implementation, policy making needs to be a lot more clear, a lot more predictable, and a lot more stable.
Yeah.
Instead of talking about the top laws or the top legal hurdles, I think it's really a question of approach. The approach needs to be to make it easier for long-term, serious investors to put large amounts of money into our country.
You see, energy jurisprudence is a very, very specialized niche as an area of study. Now with a lot of this automation coming in, it's a new AI world that is sort of emerging, evolving. What kind of impact do you see in this particular profession going forward? And this question is especially for the youth, for the students, to get a sense on what is the future of jobs in this particular niche area of energy jurisprudence wherein you operate in.
Well, I think that the whole profession of law is going to be quite seriously impacted by AI. But I think that in areas where there is specialized jurisprudence, there's still going to be a reasonable amount of scope. This is one area in which I'm quite positive. Wearing my TrustBridge hat, this is an area that we've been working on, which is not necessarily just in the electricity sector, but it has a lot of relevance for that sector. It could apply to any regulator, which is that we are using AI to develop tools to strengthen the hands of the regulator, which is coming out with regulatory orders in the power sector, but we've done it for SEBI as well, which will help them write better quality regulatory orders. We have a massive enhancement of capacity within the regulator, so that while we may have fewer issues on which we are passing regulatory orders, we have very high quality orders. I want to see the lawyers who are graduating from the best law schools and MBAs coming out of the best business schools wanting to join a regulator as their first job, because A, it pays a sufficient wage. At the moment it will not, but B, because the quality of the experience that they're getting will be then lapped up by anyone in the private sector 5 or 6 years later. That's the way that I would like to see this happening, and using AI will, I think, help in doing that, because you'll need a better quality of person within the regulator. But we need to start thinking of our regulators more seriously and funding them more generously as well. But I'm hopeful that this kind of issue might become part of the national AI mission, which will then give regulators funds in order to be able to do these sort of things. So we are just beginning to work with our first couple of regulators in order to roll out some of these tools, and hopefully we'll have a few successes which will show that this is something that can be used at a wider scale.
That is a very fascinating example I think you've given. I think the way even the NVIDIA CEO in one of his recent interviews said that instead of AI eating up these jobs, AI will gonna make these jobs far more smarter and maybe co-create a lot of new jobs one have not really imagined as of today.
Well, at least for the moment, somebody said something a couple of years ago, which certainly is still true. It might change in the future. I'm not a Nostradamus.
Yeah.
But when he was asked that are lawyers going to be replaced with AI, he said, no, lawyers are going to be replaced by lawyers who work with AI.
Yes.
So we've already, at Trilegal, we've already implemented some AI solutions in terms of document drafting and that sort of thing. And the idea is to take out the drudge part of the work, the mechanical part of the work that could be done by anyone. I'll give you an example. When I first started in the profession more than 30 years ago, I was paid about £150 an hour, because I started working in England, to fill out forms for directors' resignation and reappointment. Now, can you imagine anyone paying anyone to do that today?
Yeah.
This will be done by a secretary working with an automated form.
Yeah.
So that's, of course, that AI has grown tremendously in the last few years, but that will allow us to do a whole set of, that's freed up people's time
Exactly.
to do both more intellectually challenging and engaging work, and also to do it to a better quality, because the kinds of mistakes that humans are prone to, AI, hopefully, as long as it's not hallucinating, will pick up.
Thank you, Akshay. The energy transitions is not just about finance or about technology. It's also a lot about the right policy frameworks, the right jurisprudence, the right law or action on ground. It's also about the need for being deregulated as a sector. It's also about using AI as a tool to fast track or catalyze some of these policy decisions. And it's also finally about following the principles that will going to attract more investments in the future. It's a huge learning session for us, and I'm really thankful to our guest today.
My pleasure entirely. Thanks.
If you like this podcast, then do share your comments in the link below, and please feel free to share and subscribe.